Okay, so in this video, I'm going to show you guys how to bring in a render that was done in Arnold in ACES CG and bring it into Fusion and make sure you're comping in ACES CG and on that whole workflow. It's very simple. Okay, so here we are in Fusion. I am working in, I believe, not quite the latest version. I'm in 16, build 49. And really, as long as you're working with a semi-recent version, I don't remember which version they introduced OpenColor IO, but I think you'll be fine as long as you have like a newer version. All right, so we brought in our file. We rendered this out using the standard Cinema 4D output, EXR, ZipS, all the stuff that I go over in my previous video. Make sure you watch the video where I break down how to set up ACES CG in Arnold. Anyway, so we've got our render, we've got our car, we've got an HDRI lighting it and whatnot. We brought it in, and we need to make sure that we're working correctly in ACES. Now, typically what I would do is I might set up a view LUT that would be a 2.2 gamma sRGB workflow, but that's not what we're going to do here. All right, the first thing I need to do is give this thing an input device transform, and so that we can work in ACES, right? So let's go ahead and grab our footage. We're going to hit Shift Space Bar, and we're going to search for color, actually space, and we're going to look for OpenColor IO color space, add that in, and you can see here it has a config file that it needs, and then the source space and an output space and a look space. We're not going to do anything with the look, but we do need to navigate to that same OpenColor IO config file that we used. So let's go ahead and navigate to where that is. That's going to be my asset drive, ACES, there we go, 103. Grab that guy, cool. All right, now we know our source space is ACES CG, so let's jump up to ACES CG. And we want to work in ACES CG, but for right now, I'm just going to show you something. If we want to look at exactly how it looked when we were working in Arnold with the RIPR, we would choose the output space to be out sRGB. So right there. And now if we look at this node, this is exactly what we would have seen in the Arnold IPR with our color space set to the exact same thing. So right now, we are looking at an 8-bit output ACES CG, so it's not going to be, we don't want to work in this, we don't want to composite in this, it's going to be very limited. If we throw down a color correction after this, you're going to see if I gain it up, go ahead and look at that, it's not going to react well. It just looks very much like I'm bringing up the gain on an 8-bit image. All right, so let's delete that. We want to stay in ACES CG to comp in there, or we could work in just ACES regular. I'm actually going to do that instead. So we're just going to work in, we know the source space is ACES CG, and the working space that I'm going to choose is just going to be ACES CC. And now immediately it looks weird, and it's going to kind of look like log almost, which is totally fine. And that's how we're going to be looking, or sorry, that's how we're going to be working this entire way. But let's just say now we want to drop down a color grade, a color correction node. Boom, there it is. Let's look at that. And we don't want to look at it in the sort of log view. We want to look at it in our output transform, which is the sRGB color space. So let's just duplicate our color space. Picture this like an entry door, and then like a space, like a room, and then an exit door. So now if we push this into our little OpenColor IO, we know the incoming space was now, we moved it over to ACES CC, but we want that output to be out sRGB. Now if we look at this, it's going to look exactly like our IPR did. And in the middle here, we are working in ACES. On this end, we interpreted it as ACES CG and moved it into regular ACES. Now we're working in ACES, and now we're outputting it over here to sRGB output, our output device transform. All right, with this color correction now selected, I can bring this gain up and down, and it's now going to react exactly like we want it to. It feels more like film. It's not like blowing out those highlights, and just so we can have an idea of what the difference would be. I'll show you that part a little bit later. Okay, so that's a way to work, right? Now we're doing all of our comping in ACES, and then we're going back out to our output device transform of sRGB. And what's great about ACES is that if this needs to go somewhere else, if it needs to go out to film, you would just choose a different output device transform. But the entire thing is now controlled in ACES right in here. Another way to work, if you don't want to deal with an output device transform right away and you want to just work with a view LUT, you can just right-click in the view here, go to the LUT, and we're going to say enable, and then we're going to choose our LUT. We're going to come down to open color IO file transform view LUT. Oh, that's a mouthful. And let's go ahead and change the, we're going to say LUT edit. And we need to find that exact color IO file again. Oops, I think I did this wrong actually. This is not going to be, that needs to be set to color space view LUT. And now we can go to LUT edit and we can browse to our config file. Our source space is going to be ACES CC because that's what we're working in. And our output is going to be out sRGB. All right, that's all good. We can stop it up and down as well. All right, let's bring this guy back down to where we started him. It's going to be 1. All right, so that's exactly another way to work. So now we're actually viewing it using a view space transform out to the sRGB. And now we can do everything here, and it's the same. And at the end, if we want to, I do recommend you're going to have to output to something that's going to work correctly, like on the internet or video, whatnot. So you're going to have to definitely come back to an output space. But working this way is a nice way to kind of keep it live like this in the viewport. I typically don't. I typically will disable that, and I'll do it all with the node at the end of my comp, just so that I can, I don't know, it's just more of a visual thing, so I don't forget to do it. Okay, so I wanted to do some interesting things down here on this end to show you that there's really no difference in using the normal save output in Cinema 4D compared to the Arnold driver. There really isn't any difference. They end up doing the exact same thing as long as you're working with them in Fusion here and interpreting their color spaces correctly. It's the same thing. Just with the output driver using Arnold, like we mentioned in the previous video, you can actually bake in that output device transform. Okay, so let's see. What do we have here? I have some comparisons, and for right now, I'm just going to actually turn off this one out of the second viewer. So I'm going to put ACES CG over here on the left, and over on the right, I'm going to show you why it's better than sRGB. So over on the right-hand side, we're going to have the exact same scene, the exact same light intensity on the HDRI, and the one on the left is using ACES CG, and the one on the right is using sRGB. Now, it's pretty obvious to me which one looks more real. Now, this one doesn't have any color grade on it or anything. It's just coming straight out. You can see right here, I'm just bringing the color space into ACES CG, and then I'm outputting it out to our out sRGB. So that is pretty much all it's doing. It's pretty insane how much more realistic light and color look in this color space. And it's not just because of tone mapping, because I know a lot of people out there were like, well, isn't it just tone mapping? Well, it's not, actually. You're working in a much wider color gamut when you're working in ACES than if you're working in sRGB. So let's look at what that looks like. So we put up the second render over here where I've basically just stopped it up a few stops. And if we look over at the same one on the right in sRGB, you're going to notice a lot of the details in the highlights are completely obliterated in sRGB. They're just gone. But on the left-hand side, where we're working in ACES CG, we still have detail in the clouds. We still have detail in the horizon, in the sky. We still have details in the windows, whereas in sRGB, that is completely gone. We've lost it all. Not to mention the orange on the front of the car here still looks like it has a natural sort of gradation, some shading in here, whereas on the sRGB, it's a solid orange with like a halo line right here. It's very, very apparent why ACES is going to be a superior space to work in when you look at something like this. All right, now it gets even crazier when you start to do a really wild color lighting setup like this. So I'm going to look at the same thing over on the sRGB side. So when you start working in ACES, you start to realize just how far you can push lights, both in intensity and color. And it really opens up a lot of creative opportunities to really do things that you wouldn't have felt comfortable doing in sRGB. In sRGB, you would have gotten to this point and you would have said, well, this is getting too crazy. This blue is too bright. It's too saturated. It's doing like this halo thing. My ground is blowing out. There's like a slight halo in this area. I should probably bring the intensity down of all these lights because this is just too much. But in ACES, it can deal with it. It's actually created to sort of make it feel and act more like film. So you can push it a little bit further. You can push the intensities a little bit further. You can push the saturation a little bit further, and it's not going to break. And that's what I love about it. Like, you can really start to take advantage of it with some really creative things that you can do. I believe, yeah, okay, so this also is a good indicator. I'm going to go ahead and just push the intensity, the gain up on both of these at the same time. And you're going to notice that the sRGB is completely falling apart. And I've gained it up by 5. And the ACES CG render is still holding up. It's still doing pretty well. And the same goes if I bring it down. If I bring the intensity down, you're going to start to notice that they don't look too dissimilar. But when you start to get into the real fine-tune stuff, you start to realize that, like, it's still holding on to these midtones, and it shouldn't be. Like, this is really dark. So the dark areas are not going away as fast as you think they should. And then the light areas go away way faster than you think they should. So it's really wild. And if we look at this one as well, let's just go back to this HDRI one and adjust the color on that as well. So let's do the same thing here and just bring it way down. This one on the right, the sRGB, does not feel like we're stopping down a camera. It just feels like we're just taking the overall levels and just bringing it down, making it darker. Whereas the ACES one feels way more like you're actually stopping up or stopping down a camera. It's really wild. Okay, let's keep going. The other thing I wanted to show you is more of an indoor scene here. And now this one is very similar to the video that I showed setting up Arnold to render in ACES. If you haven't seen that, please check it out. This one is similar setup. We've just got the same HDRI, the same intensity, but we're working in ACES on the left here, sRGB on the right. Now notice what ACES does to this orange. It just keeps it nice and vibrant. Whereas in sRGB, it tends to look washed out and kind of gross. Even the nose of the car starts to look a little bit like flat here, whereas in ACES, it looks really nice. Of course, the ground is blowing out on the around the car here. So if we stop that down to get to a similar sort of, not there, I want to bring this gain down a little bit maybe. Even if we brought the gain down to sort of match what ACES was doing, look at the highlights coming off of this window. The sun coming into this room just feels wrong, as well as it does on this shade over here. The shade is like very yellow and kind of gross. So let's just undo that. So you can see ACES just gets you to a more realistic place faster. And I know a lot of people online were saying, well, why couldn't we just do this with tone mapping? Why not just use the current workflow, but just use tone mapping? And tone mapping is not bad. Actually, tone mapping is better than not doing anything at all. But it's not going to beat ACES, because what ACES is, it's not just about getting that filmic response curve. It's also a completely different way of working. And when you start to look at it that way, where you can bring in footage from multiple sources and have them all work and match, and then output them to multiple different devices and have it work properly, that's really the strength. So I want to prove that a pure tone mapping experience is not the same at all. All right, so let's start with why couldn't I just, in Redshift, for instance, you have the ability in the render view to use an open color IO output device transform right there. So why wouldn't I do that? Like, why wouldn't I just use it as a tone mapping of sorts? Well, let's take a look at that. So on the left we have the ACES CG render, and on the right we have the the EXR non-ACES sRGB render, but we're pushing it through an ACES output device transform because, hey, we're going to try to cheat it, right? Well, it doesn't really work. You can see here it falls apart on the orange. It does a slightly better job because the output device transform in ACES is very good. It's trying its best to not treat the highlights too harshly, but when it starts to where it really starts to fall apart is when you start to use it with a, I'm going to pipe in this color grade, and we are going to start to push both of these a little bit hard. So these are both linked up, so I'm using the same color correction. All right, let's just start cranking these up. Now you can see the fake OpenColor.io ACES workflow is sort of doing a good job on making sure the highlights and everything doesn't blow out too fast, but we've lost all of our color. We've lost the brilliant color that we're getting on the left, and it's sort of just desaturating everything in the highlights, which is okay, and some people want that, and that's okay because it's all about whatever works for you, but it's not the same thing. So this is sort of to prove that, and we bring the intensity down. Now it starts to sort of look very similar here. In fact, you're like, oh, well, that's actually not too bad. Again, though, it falls apart when you start getting into these really crazy colors. Let's take a look at what the exact same thing looks like in, I believe it's going to be an outdoor scenario. So let's do the same thing with an HDRI. Let's go ahead and look at the faux ACES workflow from something like Redshift, and then look at the same thing in true ACES. All right, so let's take this even and bring our gain up. Now, this is reacting a lot more like what I would expect. It's actually not too bad. The highlights are, I'm maintaining detail in the highlights. It's looking pretty good. But notice what's happening on the orange here. If I continue to walk this up, you're going to notice that this orange stays really kind of saturated and a little bit like halo-y right in here. And the rim has lost all vibrancy. The rim is like pretty much gone on the one on the right in terms of that orange color. And over here in ACES, we're holding on to that color. It looks much, much better. If we go the other way, it's not quite as apparent because it is a float EXR, so it's going to maintain that dynamic range just fine. But so it's better than nothing, but it's not a true ACES workflow. Okay, so what about tone mapping? Well, tone mapping, and the other thing, I'm just going to go back to this like faux ACES workflow. The other thing that kind of stinks about this is if you're working with footage, let's say you're adding like a CG character or something to footage, then that output device transform isn't going to help you in Redshift, because what you need to do is you need to interpret that footage into your working space, ACES CG, and then it needs to output in ACES CG as well, so that you can comp it all back together and it's going to look right. Okay, so that's important. So the other thing to note is just adding tone mapping. Like, well, what about just tone mapping? So in here we've got a Reinhardt tone mapper and we've got a filmic tone mapper. And these are both just tone mappers that come, I believe the Reinhardt one came with Fusion, and maybe the filmic one is from Reactor. I forget. I'll try to figure out where both of these came from and share it with you guys. All right, so let's look at what that does. All right, so let's take a look at a Reinhardt in our indoor sort of scene. And let's get back out to our ACES CG. So this is like a Reinhardt tone mapper, and you can see here it's got some controls, and I'm not really going to mess with those. But a tone mapper, what that's going to do is it's going to give you a more of a filmic response. It's going to desaturate the highlights. It's going to try to give you a little bit more of a curve to your render. But you can see this doesn't really work. Even if I bring the gain down, it's just not. Actually, let me do that with my linked color. Yeah, so this one. So if I bring this gain down, it's better. It's not doing anything nearly as beautiful as what the ACES is doing, and especially it falls apart when I start to blow it out. So that's just not even working at all. Now a filmic tone mapper, let's take a look at what that looks like, and let's pump in the correct input there. Now the filmic tone mapper is better than that Reinhardt one, but again, it's not a workflow. You can't work in Cinema 4D with this tone mapper applied. You could work with a tone mapper applied. In fact, there's a photographic exposure controls in Redshift, but you can't emulate those, or those can't be recreated in comp. So you're kind of just like baking it in. You're stuck with it. And I think that's a bad way to work. So that is why I think the tone mapping is better than nothing, but it's not as good as working completely in ACES. Okay, so in the next video, or in another video that I suggest watching after this, I'm going to show you how to deal with footage and work with footage in ACES, both footage not just coming in from like a comp perspective, but we're going to take footage and bring it into Arnold and render out this car on a background plate, all in ACES, and then we're going to bring it back into Fusion and comp it in ACES. We're not going to do a lot in the comp, but just to show you how that workflow happens. All right, hope you liked the video. Be sure to check out all the other videos on ACES, and I will see you next time.